Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Dr. Thaddeus Russell about the history of gun control in the United States. Dr. Russell teaches history and American studies at Occidental College. He is the author of A Renegade History of the United States and the founder of Renegade University. You can follow his work at thaddeusrussell.com. You can also find him on Facebook under thaddeus.russell.7 and on Twitter at Thaddeus Russell. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/gun-control-history. Dr. Russell, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the history of gun control. How did gun control begin in the United States?
Well, for all intents and purposes, gun control began after the Civil War with the emancipation of the slaves and the granting of suffrage to the slaves in the South, ex-slaves, male slaves in the South. In response to that, several organizations were established, semi-formal or informal organizations were established that were composed mostly of former Confederate soldiers who roamed the countryside or patrolled this countryside looking for freedmen who were armed and set out to disarm them through acts of terror. And one of those organizations was the Ku Klux Klan. So the sort of original white supremacist organizations in the United States were the first gun control organizations in the United States. This is not really debated among historians. There were some attempts earlier in the Republic to disarm some of the colonists, but in the United States, there's no debate that that gun control began as a racist project in the South after the Civil War.
All right, so I want to return to that topic in a moment, but let's go to the founding period. Whenever the topic of gun control comes up, especially from people who support what we might call the gun rights movement or pro-Second Amendment, they always reference the founders. And yet the founders still promoted the disarmament of some groups and some individuals, of loyalists, of slaves, of free blacks. What was the gun control like during the founding generation, and what's the truth about the founding fathers and their promotion of gun rights?
I mean, it was loose. It was relatively unenforced. There were some noises made by some founding fathers to do that, but there was very little in the way of that. It was certainly not a national effort. It wasn't a unified, organized effort. So there really was very little of that until, as I said, after the Civil War. You know, the founding fathers were mixed on gun rights, as they were on most issues. Some promoted it, some did not. But generally speaking, in terms of, sort of an organized effort to enforce gun control or to take guns away from particular individuals, that was not really a unified organized effort until much later.
And you were saying earlier that it was a racist, had racist beginnings. So can you expound upon that a little bit more and talk about how that really all started?
Well, so I mean, at the end of the Civil War, as slaves are becoming emancipated during and after the Civil War, they, in many cases, are taking guns with them that they procured from masters. Either they stole them or they were just given them by masters or by just ordinary whites. And so the slaves were very well armed at the end of the Civil War and, began to establish their political rights, began to organize politically, were active members in the Republican Party, were given the vote by Congress in the South, and in many cases held elective office in the South. So they were politically powerful and they were armed, and this was a threat to the ex-Confederates. And so the ex-Confederates organized these night rider organizations. They were basically men on horses with guns who, as I said, roamed the countryside looking for these slaves, and they would go to some slaves' dwelling and try to find them and seize the guns. And if they needed to, they would use their arms and they'd fire on these ex-slaves and sometimes kill them. One of the things we know is that in many, many cases, the ex-slaves fired back. And so you have tremendous amount of violence during the Reconstruction period, which goes from 1865 into the mid-1870s, that goes both ways. I mean, certainly more blacks were killed, but there was a tremendous amount of resistance, armed resistance by the ex-slaves. So there was really a sort of a second civil war, actually, in that period, which unfortunately the white supremacists basically won when Reconstruction was abolished in the 1870s and slaves were disenfranchised. But along the way, many of them were disarmed because of this.
So why isn't gun control today associated with these sort of racial undertones that you've been discussing?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. So the racist history of gun control just only begins in the 1860s. It continues all the way through the sort of mid-20th century. The first major gun control law on a state level was passed in California in the late 1860s in response to the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers in Oakland had armed patrols. This was when there was basically no gun control in California. So you had groups of black men patrolling Oakland, and when they saw the streets of Oakland, and when they saw a police officer pulling over a black person, they would get out of their cars and walk up to them holding rifles. They wouldn't point the rifles at the police, but they would be carrying rifles with them, and they would just observe. They would observe what was going on, obviously, to sort of prevent police brutality or police abuse. And then the Black Panthers became very brazen, and they marched on the state capitol in Sacramento, in California, to sort of demonstrate their power and to protest an attempt to take away their guns. That was a bill that was in the state legislature. That bill passed and became the first major gun control law in the United States on the state level, which then became ultimately that bill was the model for the first national gun control bill, national gun control law. So, and by the way, the governor who signed the bill to make it law in California was Ronald Reagan. It was a bill that was authored by a Republican and signed into law by Ronald Reagan, the Republican governor, directly in response to the Black Panthers. So, from the beginning to well into the 1960s, mid-20th century, gun control was consistently used to disarm black people. And again, as I said, this isn't really debated. I mean, any historian who's serious about this, who studied this, wouldn't disagree.
Yeah, and I was going to mention Reagan's connection because it's a very interesting thing. And nowadays, Reagan is associated with as being some sort of great conservative figure. And of course, conservatives or so-called conservatives are all for gun rights, or at least they claim to be. So it's very interesting that Reagan has that background as part of the gun control side of this. Yeah,
it is. Sort of depends on who holds power, right? Whoever holds power tends to be in favor of disarming the populace. So, or whoever's seeking power, I suppose, is interested in disarming the rebellious populace in the case of the Civil War. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't cut along traditional left-right lines. And so how it became a liberal cause is a good question, and I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, it becomes a liberal cause in sort of the 1980s and 1990s, and that's a really good question, and historians haven't gotten there yet. That's sort of too late in a sense in the chronology for historians to have studied it in a serious way. It's a great question that should be studied, and historians should address that soon. But it is certainly considered to be a liberal cause now, and most liberals who espouse gun control are ignorant of the history of the cause that they're promoting.
Right. Now, around the time of the Black Panthers, you also had riots breaking out across the country in Newark and Detroit and Watts and elsewhere. What role did those riots play in bringing about new federal gun legislation? Yeah,
I mean, that was part of it as well. So you have, in the 1960s, you have those riots. You have major riots in Harlem and Detroit and Newark and Watts. And in every case, people in those neighborhoods used guns against police and the National Guard and the Army. So that, of course, was quite alarming to many people, and that did feed into the calls for gun control, which really, again, was specifically directed at Black people in those neighborhoods, in those cities. So yeah, it is from the beginning until pretty recently, really, it has been an effort to gun control has been an effort to disarm particular groups of Blacks.
And what about the legal history in respect to the Second Amendment? How many cases have been brought up saying that this is a violation of the Second Amendment? How many of those have been successful, and what has the history of that been?
I'm not clear. I'm not sure what your question is, and I'm not really well versed in the judicial history of this. I'm trying to think. I don't know if challenges. I think that you're talking about invoking a Second Amendment, of course, don't arise until after the 1960s, when there are serious gun control laws, as far as I know.
All right. Now, one topic we've touched on a little bit here is whether gun control is a liberal phenomenon or a conservative phenomenon. Can you explain how gun control is conservative in many ways? Because that might be a new concept to many of our listeners.
Well, you have to define conservative first, right? So, if it means conserving traditional norms and values, it's neither conservative nor liberal, right? Because the United States has had moments where it's attempted to control guns or violate gun rights, and when it hasn't. So, and also, there is a Second Amendment, so most founding fathers favored gun rights, but there were some who did not. So again, what exactly are you trying to conserve in that case? I suppose the conservative argument, but again, it's not really a conservative argument. It's actually a revolutionary argument, which I think is the most compelling one. It's used by conservatives, oddly, but it is that governments tend to become tyrannical, and that the people will have no recourse against a tyrannical government if they are disarmed. I find that to be a very compelling argument, which I ironically have heard almost entirely from conservatives, people who tend to be anti-revolutionary, right? But it's really a revolutionary argument. I have heard it, however, presented by socialist revolutionaries, radical leftist revolutionaries too. Not many, but some. The ones who really, to me, understand what revolution is about have said this. In fact, when I was growing up in Berkeley, my parents were revolutionary socialists, and one of their friends owned a gun, and that was the first time I ever saw a gun. And this is when I heard this argument. I said, "Why do you have a gun?" He said, "Well, because when the revolution comes, we will need guns." And so I don't really hear that argument very much anymore. I think only very, very hardcore leftists will use it. And I don't know what that is. I think that's that has to do with the decline of a radical left in this country. There isn't much of one anymore, a truly revolutionary left. And I think it also has to do with probably the rise of state power in the last 100 or so years. Since the Progressive era, we've seen a tremendous increase in state power in the United States. And I think that conservatives have been the ones who have been most concerned about that. And they've understood that at the end of the day, what state power is a monopoly on violence, and that the only way to have any defense against that is to be armed. And so that they've seen gun control as an attack on their last defense against a tyrannical government. So I suppose that's how it's aligned, left and right.
Okay. All right, now let's go back to some historical episodes and historical periods and the role of gun control in those times. The Wild West is often thought of as a period where there was not in a place where there was not a lot of gun control, where people carried guns and did what they wanted with them. But what's the truth about gun confiscation and gun rights in the Wild West and in frontier towns?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of evidence, but we have some, and the evidence that I'm aware of is that there were some towns in the West in the late 19th century, what we now call the Wild West, where the local law enforcement required people to turn in their guns when they walked into town, and they held them until they left. So that there was sort of radical, complete gun control in some of these towns, and others there was none, right? Well, in many of these towns, there was no law enforcement at all, so there was no one to control the guns, really. There may have been some sort of informal militias who attempted that, But in terms of the state doing it, it was here and there. But it is certainly true, from what I understand of the evidence, and the evidence is spotty though, that the gun control was that gun control was non-existent in the so-called Wild West. That there were some attempts by local law enforcement in Western towns to, in fact, confiscate guns entirely. But again, that was uneven and not organized on a national level or even a regional level.
So can you talk a bit more about how gun control is often kind of forced out of fear of ordinary citizens? I know you were talking about how back during the Reconstruction, a lot of the white slaveholders, ex-slaveholders, feared black citizens with guns. And I think that's important when framing the entire argument of gun control and when framing the idea is understanding this really a policy made out of fear of people.
Oh, yeah, sure. Fear, yes. Fear of the people. And
yes.
But I'd say in this country, it's been a fear of particular people, right? So it's been a fear of, certainly criminals, although that argument makes no sense because under gun control, criminals are the only people who have guns. But there's also been, obviously, as I've said, fear of armed black people. It's fear of armed black people that is the history of gun control, primarily in this country. There's no question about that. One of the things, we haven't talked about, which is also very, very important, is the relationship between guns and the civil rights movement. The, gun control laws were loose or non-existent in the South during Jim Crow. So by the 1940s and 1950s, a lot of the ex-slaves and their descendants had regained control of guns and owned guns. And it was very common for ordinary black people in the segregated South to own guns. And when the civil rights movement proper gets going in the 1950s, in many, many cases, organizers depended on people, on armed guards, to conduct their business of organizing people to vote, to go on marches, etc. So, including Martin Luther King, by the way, whose house in Alabama was well-stocked, was actually called an armory by someone, an arsenal. He apparently had many, many guns of all kinds in his house to defend himself. He never had to use them until, of course, later. But when he was actually organizing in the 50s and 60s, no one ever directly attacked his house with guns. But anyway, he had guns, and he was surrounded with people who used them as well. But this is true for many organizers across the Deep South, especially in Mississippi. There were towns across southern Mississippi that were, incredibly racist and segregationist and violent, where local SNCC organizers who were signing up people, registering people to vote, or attempting to register people to vote. They used local sort of basically black militias, really loosely sort of organized black militias were well armed to defend them. And so it has been argued by several historians, including me, that the civil rights movement really depended upon guns and armed resistance and lacks gun control or no gun control to exist.
Wow, that's a very interesting statement. I mean, it makes sense, but it's not the sort of thing you would typically hear, at least from the mainstream media, and I suppose in textbooks when you're growing up and going to public schools.
Yeah, I think it really has to do with, well, in terms of the schools, I mean, the schools have been controlled by, liberals, New Deal liberals, for many decades, who are completely attached, intertwined with the state, depend upon the state, obviously. And so, and I think the left generally has become completely dependent upon the state. There's not really much of an anti-statist left anymore. They see the state as the vehicle for all their visions for social reform. And so I think that's really a big part of it is that, they see guns as not just threatening, innocent children in schools in Connecticut, but threatening their larger political project, which is, state control over most of life. So, I mean, I think that's a big part of it. This, again, like since the progressive era, the turn of the 20th century, there's been a simultaneous growth of the state and an increasing attachment by those on the left to the state. So now we see sort of a left or a liberal left that really controls the discourse and controls certainly public education, who is, dependent upon the state and committed to defending it. So I think that's probably at least in the unconscious of a lot of leftists and liberals when they talk about gun control. I think that they fear people acting on their own against the state in ways that could be destructive of their larger project.
All right, yeah, let's go back to the Progressive Era for a moment. What did gun control legislation look like during the Progressive Era, and can you talk a little bit more about how gun control fit into sort of the overall progressive agenda?
There wasn't much gun control until the New Deal. There were, I think, two laws that were passed, I believe, during the New Deal in the 1930s. I could be wrong about that. There may have been one earlier in the 10s during the Progressive Era. But again, these were much looser. They did regulate certain guns, but they were still quite loose compared to the post 1960s regime. But the attempt to control guns during the Progressive and New Deal eras came from the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover in particular. But the New Dealers were really pushing this. I know that. But New Dealers were quite interested in gun control, which makes a lot of sense, as in terms of what I was saying, right? They were interested and embarking on a tremendous expansion of the nation state and its control over the people. And so they were quite concerned with crime. They were concerned with crime, and they were also concerned with revolutionaries. This was a time when the Socialist Party and the Communist Party were actually quite powerful. They constituted, probably 1 or 2 million people in this country were self-identified as socialists or communists. The Communist Party had a large membership. The Socialist Party had quite a large membership in the 10s, 20s, and 30s. So, socialist revolution wasn't imminent, but it was not impossible. And the progressives and leaders of the New Deal were very well aware of this. And that's one of the reasons that they were eager to pass these reforms. New Deal reforms was to stave off revolution, to sort of steal the thunder from the revolutionaries. But, they knew that wasn't necessarily permanent. They knew that the revolutionaries might stick around. They knew that the Depression could come back. And I think they were interested in disarming people who could upset their project, So again, I think one's relationship or one's attitude toward the state and state power really determines one's attitude toward guns and gun control.
Well, that's interesting, because that's not how the argument is currently phrased right now by people who promote it and by people who detract gun control measures, right? A lot of times we hear about safety issues and then magazine size, and it's often related to
it's
public shootings. Yeah,
it's completely depoliticized now. I mean, there's no. I mean, I've heard dismissals of the arguments, the political arguments made against gun control. But there's no. From the left, I've heard no sort of serious counter argument. Right, and they don't need to, because they've got all the horror stories. They've got the moral force of the nation on their side. They've got Oprah Winfrey on their side. They've got all the celebrities. They got President Obama crying on camera. They've got all the feelings. And so they don't need to make arguments. It's very interesting. I mean, I would love to sit Michael Moore down sometime and go over this history with him and hear his response. I mean, I wonder if he's even aware. I don't know if he's even aware of the racist history, the racist, conservative, statist history of gun control that he champions, that he's very much, there's no one more responsible for the ascendancy of the gun control movement than Michael Moore. I mean, that movie was, big, and that was very effective and really got people, I think, pushed a lot of people to be hardcore gun control advocates. These people are never forced to confront this. Now, who knows? Their arguments may win out in the end, but what is frustrating to me is that they're never forced to confront counter arguments. Never. They never do it. It's just they keep going, and the next school shooting or the next spree shooting or the next mass shooting, they just trot out the same statements. They're not even arguments, right? These are just sort of, it's like whether to have safety tops on prescription bottles or something. And it's not, that's the level of it. There's no sort of no intellectual or political sophistication or depth to it, what they say. Yeah, I mean, I'd love someday. Hopefully, we can like force them onto a podcast or onto a stage or onto a TV show and actually confront them with this evidence and the history and the argument and see what they have to say. But I've not heard that.
Well, yeah, that would be great. So do you have a prediction on where this is headed, on what might happen? It seems like in the Democratic primary, this has been a big issue. And while maybe in the larger question of American society, it's not quite as big of an issue. Whenever it seems like whenever there's a mass shooting, as we've mentioned here and there, it comes out again. So do you have a prediction on where this is headed and on what major changes we may see?
I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm not supposed to make predictions. But I would not be surprised if we go Australian, if the United States ends up adopting the Australian model of essentially bribing people, paying people to give up their guns. It's essentially confiscation, but not quite. It's like a sweetened deal confiscation in Australia. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up there. I think the mass shootings are going to continue for the foreseeable future. I don't think that's because of access to guns. I think that because there's a deep unhappiness in the population, and in particular segments of the population that need to be examined. I mean, I think that's where the issue is. I think it's the people who do these things clearly are very, very unhappy and very angry for a lot of reasons. And I think there are some through lines in all these stories. I think there's some consistent problems that we see in their psyches and that need to be addressed first. And I'd like to do that. I think that I think are somewhat unique to American culture. And I think that is what needs to be addressed. I think it has to do with masculinity. I think there's something about whiteness, racial identity in there. And I think there is something about our particular brand of capitalism that makes it very difficult. I think it's quite difficult, actually. I really do think it's quite difficult to be a white man in the United States, and that needs to be addressed.
Okay. Thank you so much for your valuable time, and thank you for coming on the show.
Okay. Thank you.
Where can our listeners go to find more of your work and read some more of the stuff you've done?
My website's the place to go, ThaddeusRussell.com. And my book, A Renegade History of the United States, is available on Amazon. And I'm on Twitter at Thaddeus Russell.
Okay, great. And can you talk about Renegade University a little bit?
Sure. So I'm launching a project this year, which will be a series of lectures and seminars, online and in person in various cities, that will cover the topics in my book, A Renegade History, as well as other topics having to do with political philosophy and current events and foreign relations with the United States, the history of foreign relations with the United States, which is the book that I'm working on now. It'll be coming out soon.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, that sounds very interesting. And maybe when that comes out, we can talk to you again.
Sure. Great.
Yeah, but in the meantime, I want to encourage everybody to go check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/gun-control-history. And we'll link to ThaddeusRussell.com. We'll link to your Twitter account, everything related to this episode. wakeupcallpodcast.com/gun-control-history is the place for that. And I also want to encourage everybody to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast is the handle for our Twitter account. And Dr. Russell, thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.